Okay, in this lesson we're going to look at continuing soloing over a 12-bar blues progression that uses dominant 7 chords. Now we've looked at the Mixolydian blues and some licks that we can do with those. We've done an example solo which shows you how to play over the changes to some extent. But we're going to take that further now and we're going to look at the use of arpeggios. Now arpeggios are just the notes of a chord played individually. So we're going to be playing dominant 7 arpeggios. And we're going to look at it from each of the root notes of the chord progression. So in A7, in A, it will be A7, D7 and E7. Now this can serve two purposes. The first one, which we'll explore in more depth next lesson, is to give you some licks using arpeggios. So that is one way, but I said we'll look at that more in the next lesson. The other way is it helps you to identify notes of the chord. Now this is really important because what makes licks and melody sound good is the notes that you're playing fitting the notes of the chord. So this is a problem that I find a lot of guitar players come across. They know a bunch of licks but don't necessarily know where to play them, and that's because they don't understand the chords underneath and the notes within those chords. Once you understand that, it makes it so much easier to place licks and to also get a whole bunch of new licks where you go across the changes, where you can play from one chord to another. You can get some nice ideas if you know like chord tones that are next to each other, which you'll see an example of in today's lesson. It's a boring example, but it will be just outlining notes that you can play across the changes, and you'll see and you'll be able to hear it. So I'll play the example solo that I've done. It's really, really basic. It's just meant to show you where different notes of the chords are. And we're changing, we're going from A7 to D7, A7, D7, A7, E7, D7, A7. Same as the 12-bar blues progression that we did in the earlier lessons, okay, but with the dominant 7 chords. And we're just going to follow those with the relevant arpeggios. So when it goes to D7, we'll be playing D7 arpeggio, E7, E7 arpeggio. And it will just help you to know where the notes of the chords are, so that when you're soloing, you can look to resolve notes, licks to notes of the chord. So it hasn't always got to be to root notes. So like we did in one of the earlier minor pentatonic lessons, where we were in the key of A, we would do licks, land on an A note, and then when it goes to D, land on a D note. When it goes back to A, land on A. When it goes to E, up to an E note, down to D, etc. Well, you haven't just got to play the root notes. That sounds great. That's cool. It's perfectly acceptable to do. But to mix it up even further, we can land on different notes of the chord. So I'll play the example solo through, and then we'll look at it in a bit more depth, and I'll take you through it. Okay, so the three main arpeggio shapes that we're going to use here, the A7, now the notes of that are A, C sharp, E, G, A. And the intervals of that are 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Remember, a dominant chord, dominant arpeggio, dominant 7 arpeggio, is a major triad, 1, 3, 5, with a minor 7, a flat 7. So it's 1, 3, 5, flat 7. That's really important to remember. D7. And here we're playing the notes D, F sharp, A, C. And again, the intervals of that, because it's a dominant 7 chord, 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Same intervals. That's why we learn them in the numerical way because it can be applied to any key. And then E7, we're just going to do the same shape as that. And the notes of that would be E, G sharp, B, D, and back up to the E. So those are our three main arpeggios that we're going to be using. We will come out of those particular shapes slightly, but they will still be those notes. The important thing is it's 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Those notes from each root note. Okay, so let's take you through it then. We start off on the A7 chord and we play an A7 arpeggio. We go 7th fret on the D string. We go 6th fret on the G. 5th fret on the B, and then back to 6th fret on the G. So we actually just run up a major triad there. Now we're going to change to D. Yeah, it goes to D7. So we do one chord of A7, then it changes to the D. And you can see that that note there, the 6th fret within the A chord, there, the third, leads to the root note of the D. So when I play this, even if we haven't got the chords behind it, you should still be able to hear the chord changes. And that is a really important skill for soloing. And that touches upon a huge, huge subject. If you get into more like jazzy things, that can go crazy when you're changing chords 2, 3, 4 times in a bar. Into the D7, we go 7, 7, 5, 8. 7 on the G, 7 on the B, 5 on the E, 8 on the E. Now this note here is going to lead us to the third of A. So we're only doing one bar on D7 and we've got to change back to A7. And we're going to land on the second note of A7, which is the third. In this case it's C sharp. And we're doing it here, 9th fret on the E string. So I'll play it all the way through. And that takes us back to the A. From there, we're going to come back down. We're going to go from the 9th on the E. We go 5 on the E. We go 5 on the B. 6 on the G. Just come down in A major arpeggio. So there's no flat 7 in that particular bit. We then go to the A note on the 7th fret D string. And then we run up the A7 arpeggio. So we go 7 on the D, 6 on the G, 5 on the B, 8 on the B. So that whole A7 run would go like this. Now we've got to change back to D7 for 2 bars. We've landed on this G note here. Now the third of D is F sharp, which is only 1 fret below. So that's going to be a good note for us to change to. And you can hear it, it almost sounds like it resolves as the chord changes. And that's a really good tool to use to create nice melodies, good sounding licks. If you've got a note within a chord, or the chord that you're on, that isn't in the next one, is good, and they're a semitone apart, it's a good way to change. Play around with it, it sounds cool. So, from here, now we're into D7. From here, we're going to play so 7th fret on the B, 7 on the G, back to 7 on the B, 5 on the E, and then 8 on the E string. We then come back down, we go to 5 on the E, 7 on the B, 7 on the G. So those 2 bars on D7. Now we're going to change back to A7 for 2 bars. We've landed on this D note here. Now the third of A7 is C sharp, which is just 1 fret below, so that's the note that we're going to target as the chord changes back to A7. From there we go 7th fret on the D, back to the 6th on the G, 5 on the B, 8 on the B, 5 on the B, 6 on the G, and then back to the root note of A, 7th fret D string. So those 2 bars on A7. Then we go up to an E7 chord. Now, the third of E7 is the 7th of A. So when we learnt the Mixolydian blues in the key of A, we wouldn't have actually played that note. So this is a cool thing to be aware of. You can put that note in when it goes to E7. And actually next week's lesson looks at moving which Mixolydian blues scale that you're playing on each root note. So when we're on the A7, we'll play A Mixolydian blues or A7 licks. When it goes to D7, we'll move to D Mixolydian blues or just D7 licks. And when it goes to the E, same thing, E Mixolydian blues, E7 licks. So for this exercise today, just be aware that this is a new note that you wouldn't have done in the previous stuff. And it only really works on this E chord because it's the third of E, it's within the chord there. So we finished the last lick on the 7th fret D string A here. And the third of E7 is G sharp. So it's a semitone below. It's going to sound good if we go between them on the chord changes. So when we get to the E chord, we play the 6th fret on the D. We then play the 7th fret on the A. We then come up to the 9th fret on the G. And we're going to do a chromatic note. Okay, a note that's not necessarily in the scale. I mean, it will be in the Mixolydian blues, but in E7, it wouldn't necessarily pop up. But it works well because it's leading us to the D chord. Now this is another subject again, using chromatic leading notes to take you to a root note or a note of the next chord. In real simple terms here, we've got to get from an E note here to a D note here. So all we're doing is putting that note in between. Pretty simple. So. And that leads us into the D chord, because we're only on E7 for 1 bar, remember. Then once we get to D, we go 7th fret on the G, 7th fret on the B, 5th fret on the E, 7th fret on the D. Then the chords change to A7, so we drop down to the 6th. We play 6th fret G string, 7th fret on the D, 6th fret on the G again, 7th on the G. Then it goes up to the E7, and we're going to come up to the E on the 9th fret on the G string. We then move up to the 9th on the B, 7th on the E, and we're putting in another chromatic note here, the 8th fret on the E string, which will lead us to the 3rd of A as the 12-bar progression cycles back round. There. So as we finish on an A chord, you'd end on that note. So that E7 lick. Now, like I said before, this is really basic, really simple. It's not a fancy solo. This isn't something that I'd expect you to play as a solo. This is an exercise. It's just a way for you to start mapping out and understanding the notes of the chords and which notes you can resolve licks to. So what I'd recommend is, once you've got to grips with that, is to improvise and solo with some of the licks that we've done before, whether it was like the minor pentatonic ones originally, adding in the major third like we did last time with the Mixolydian blues licks. But then when you're playing over the chord progression, really think about the changes. The 12-bar blues is the best chord progression to learn this kind of stuff over, because it's always the same, bar a couple of slight variations, which are easy to adjust to. And it's a very familiar sound. You know, if you just picked up a jazz piece like Giant Steps and then tried to play over that, okay, you would get very frustrated very quickly. 12-bar blues progression is a sound that we all recognise. It's been used in millions and millions of songs. It's really easy to practice this method of playing to the chord changes, landing on notes of the chord, not only notes of the root, not only the root notes, and generally understanding what you're playing better. Okay, a lot of guitar players will just know the key and then go, well, it's A minor, so I play A minor pentatonic and bam, 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 and don't think about the chords underneath. But when you start to think about the chords underneath and play into those changes and landing on chord tones, notes of the chord, you get a much more interesting sound and you get much nicer licks. Okay, have fun with that. Try your best to create some licks out of these arpeggios, link them in with the Mixolydian stuff that we did in the previous lessons, and make sure you jam over the backing track supplied. Really think about the changes and force yourself to land on different notes.